Welcome to Anews. I'm Ömer Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. On today's episode, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and political analyst Javed Rana will join me to discuss the latest developments for this week. We'll touch upon a host of different topics, including the dissolution of the PKK terror group, Turkish President Erdogan's invitation to Russian and Ukrainian leaders, and the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
In a development viewed as a turning point in Turkey's modern history, the terrorist group PKK has officially declared its dissolution, bringing an end to a terror campaign that spanned over 4 decades. The announcement was made on Monday through a media outlet affiliated with the group and comes shortly after the PKK held an extraordinary congress in response to a call from its imprisoned ringleader. This move marks a critical milestone in the Terror-Free Türkiye initiative, an ambitious national effort led by the Nationalist Movement Party, a key partner in the government. The initiative, launched last year, has sought to promote peace, unity, and security across all regions of the country through inclusive dialogue and resolute counter-terrorism policy. The PKK's statement comes after its ringleaders convened for a rare congress held secretly in northern Iraq, where it was reported that the remaining leadership voted to dissolve the organization in line with the ringleader's earlier call. In February, PKK's jailed ringleader issued a message urging the group to end its terror campaign and embrace peace. That message was later read aloud by a delegation of lawmakers during a press event in Istanbul, setting the stage for what would become the group's final internal summit. The PKK, which is listed as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the United States, and the European Union, has been responsible for more than 40,000 deaths, including thousands of civilians and security personnel. Its campaign of violence, which began in the early 1980s, caused immense suffering particularly in southeastern Turkey but also failed to achieve its political aims. The decision to disband has been widely welcomed across Turkey as a reflection of the nation's growing strength, unity, and determination to move beyond the shadow of terrorism. Senior officials have emphasized that while the dissolution of the PKK marks a symbolic and strategic victory, efforts to ensure long-term peace will continue through the implementation of inclusive policies, investment in regional development, and active dialogue with local communities. Security analysts suggest that the group's dissolution may also ease tensions across the region and reinforce Turkey's standing as a stabilizing power. By eliminating one of the most entrenched sources of instability, the country is now positioned to focus more deeply on social progress, economic growth, and cultural renewal in historically affected areas. As Turkey moves forward, the dissolution of the PKK is likely to be remembered as a historic success of the country's steadfast will to preserve the rule of law, uphold public safety, and ensure that every citizen can live in dignity and security.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Ömer.
Mustafa, let's start with the breaking news first. The PKK terror group has decided to disband. It has said that it will lay down its arm and eventually dissolve itself. So what are the latest updates, please?
Ömer, I think today can be described as a turning point in Turkey's modern history because, as you know, PKK terror group announced its decision to dissolve itself and lay down its weapons. As you know, separatist PKK terror group launched its terror campaign against the Turkish state in early 1980s, and since then Turkish security forces have been relentlessly fighting against the PKK terror group within and beyond the country. And as you know, last year Turkish government's political ally, Nationalist Movement Party, launched Türkiye Terror-Free Türkiye initiative. And since then, both the Turkish government and pro-PKK political party within the country have been taking steps to put an end to the PKK's terror campaign. As you know, PKK's jailed ringleader, Abdullah Öcalan, issued a message in February urging the terror group to disband itself and lay down its weapons. And within this context, as you know, last week, PKK terror group held its congress in northern Iraq. They announced that they took important and historic decisions, and they will announce these decisions. And today, PKK terror group announced its decision to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. I think PKK terror group was totally eliminated within Turkey, because, as you know, Turkish security forces have been taking tough measures against the PKK terror group. And I think today's announcement is just symbolic in terms of putting an end to the PKK terror group, because on the ground, PKK was totally eliminated by the Turkish security forces. Within this context, from here, I wish Allah's mercy upon all Turkish martyrs and Turkish civilians, those who sacrifice their lives for the independence and future of Turkey.
Mustafa, over 40,000 people have been killed, and for 47 years, the PKK terror group has been conducting all those terror activities inside Turkey and across Turkey, even outside of Turkey as well. Now, I want to ask you about the terror-free initiative, Mustafa. Devlet Bahçeli, who is the leader of the MHP, he proposed this plan. He said that enough of attacks, enough of terrorism, let's sit down at the negotiating table, let's hold talks, and let's try to eliminate terrorism once and for all. Now, also a key part of this terror-free initiative was DEM party lawmaker Siri Süreyya Önder, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. And that obviously deals a blow to the entire initiative, because he was a leading member. He was holding talks with ringleader Öcalan. And, you know, now that we've seen that the PKK has said it will dissolve itself, what is the position of this initiative? Tell me from the beginning, Mustafa, how did this initiative come into being? What was the message that was released by Devlet Bahçeli? And how has the Turkish government pursued this initiative to obtain a terror-free Turkey?
Umar, last September, I think Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli announced an important steps to normalize the political situation in country. As you know, in the opening session of the Turkish Parliament, Devlet Bahçeli shook hands with pro-PKK lawmakers in the Parliament, and it started all process, I think. Then Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli also urged PKK terror groups jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan to announce the dissolution of the PKK terror group. And since then, as I said, Turkish government and other political parties in the Turkey, both the ruling and opposition parties, have been taking steps to realize the government's terror-free Turkey initiative. As you know, pro-PKK party lawmakers held several talks with both the ruling party, AK Party, and opposition parties, including People's Republic Party and Nationalist Movement Party. And they also visited PKK's jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan. And following that meeting, Öcalan urged and called upon the PKK members to dissolve the separatist terror group and lay down their weapons. And he called for peace with the Turkish state. And since then, as you know, some other lawmakers have been also calling for the dissolution of the PKK terror group. As you said, one of the important actors within the pro-PKK party, Siri Süreyya Önder, passed away last month, and it didn't affect the process, I think, political process. And today, PKK announced its decision to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. I hope it will bring long-standing peace and stability to the country in line with the Turkish government's terror-free Turkey initiative.
Mustafa, for almost 50 years now, the Turkish government has been fighting PKK terrorists. and PKK's terror activities. Now, there have been multiple attacks over the past few years. We've seen reports of how children were snatched from their mothers in Diyarbakir, taken away to terror camps and to the mountains to train them and to make them a part of the terror group PKK. Now, Mustafa, tell me about the ramifications that this decision will have, because we know PKK is not just restricted to Turkey. There's northern Iraq, there's northern Syria. What sort of an impact would this decision have on the forces, let's say, in Syria, where there's the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK terror group? And secondly, how is the United States looking at this decision?
Of course, there will be ramifications for the regional geopolitical stability and security in the Middle East, because, as you know, PKK is not only operating in Turkey, they are also operating in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. As you know, Turkish security forces conducted several cross-border operations in terms of eliminating the PKK terror threat within Iraq and Syria. And within this context, I think PKK's today decision taken by its ringleaders will have ramifications for the regional security. As you know, geopolitical situation totally changed in Syria in December as the opposition forces took control of the country. As you know, in March, new rulers in Syria and PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot PYD and YPG, reached an agreement. Right now, Syrian security forces are taking control of the northern part of the country occupied by the PKK terror group, Syrian branch, PYD, YPG. As you also mentioned about it, the United States is still continuing to support PKK terror group, Syrian offshoot, PYD, YPG. United States called them SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, because Turkey is criticizing the United States for supporting the internationally recognized terrorist group PKK. But United States claims that they are separate from the PKK terrorist organization, and they are separate political groups within the country. Because, as you know, Turkish security forces also eliminated Daesh terror threat in northern Syria, and Turkey conducted several cross-border operations in Syria to eradicate PKK terror threat in the country. And right now, Turkey, I think, will continue to monitor the latest developments in Syria, because I think if there is any separate PYD-YPG political structure in northern Syria, I think Turkish security forces will be compelled to conduct another cross-border operation in the northern Syria in terms of ensuring Turkey's national security and territorial integrity. I hope PKK's decision to dissolve itself will also include the dissolution of the PYD-YPG. Otherwise, I think Turkey will continue to take steps to uphold regional peace and security in the Middle East.
Of course, the PYD-YPG, obviously, they have had a huge impact in Syria, and they've been behind some of the terror attacks that we've seen in northern Syria over the last few years. Now, Mustafa, what I want to ask you now is that we're living in a very volatile region, right? Now, we've seen the problems regarding Israel and Palestine, then India and Pakistan a few days ago. The last 2 weeks have been, filled with what's the response going to be, what the solution is going to be between when we look at these two nuclear-armed neighbors. So this is a very volatile region, right? There's so many problems. There's the Palestine issue. There's Turkey's fight against terrorism. Then there's the Eastern Mediterranean. There's migration. What sort of a decision, or let's say action, would this allow the Turkish government to take now that the PKK says that it will dissolve? What sort of an impact will this region see as a result of this statement?
Well, as you know, Turkey is always calling for regional solutions for regional problems. And Within this context, last week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed Iraqi Prime Minister to the presidential complex in the capital of Ankara. And the Turkish and Iraqi decision makers discussed all aspects of bilateral relationships between Turkey and Iraq, as well as exchanging views on the latest geopolitical developments in the Middle East. As you know, Turkey is always calling upon the regional countries to increase their collaboration and cooperation with Turkey in terms of bringing a long-lasting peace and stability to the Middle East region. And Turkey has been always taking steps to increase its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with both Iraq and Syria to uphold the regional security. Within this context, as you know, Turkey is also in talks with new rulers in Syria to discuss what can be done in terms of bringing and reconstructing Syria's political and economic infrastructure. I think if these countries take Turkey's demands into the consideration, I think it will yield positive results for not only Turkey's national security and territorial integrity, but also all the peace process in the Middle East region. I think Turkey, Iraq, and Syria will continue to strengthen their cooperation in the fight against terrorism. And PKK announced its decision to dissolve itself. PKK will be eliminated from the regional politics, I think. And I hope Turkish government will continue to take steps to increase its cooperation, all regional stakeholders in terms of bringing long-lasting peace and tranquility to the region.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. Now, President Erdogan has invited Ukrainian and Russian leaders to Istanbul to hold talks to end the war in Ukraine. Let's take a look at this news report.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded guardedly on Sunday to a proposal from Russian President Vladimir Putin of rapid, direct talks aimed at ending the war. Putin made his proposal in a televised statement from the Kremlin on Saturday, more than 3 years after he sent Russian forces to invade the smaller neighbor. U.S. President Donald Trump, who says he wants to be remembered as a peacemaker, called Putin's proposal, quote, a potentially great day for Russia and Ukraine. Trump broke from his predecessor, Joe Biden, in dropping a demand for an immediate Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, and instead pressed both sides to agree to a temporary ceasefire.
I want a ceasefire.
With guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
Zelensky and other Western allies resisted this, saying a pause in fighting would allow Russia to redeploy forces for further attacks. But they relented in the face of U.S. pressure and accepted the idea of a temporary truce. The Ukrainian leader said it was, quote, a positive sign that the Russians have finally begun to consider ending the war, but that, quote, the very first step in truly ending the war is a ceasefire. He said, quote, we expect Russia to confirm a ceasefire, full, lasting, and reliable, starting tomorrow, May 12th, and Ukraine is ready to meet. On Saturday, Zelensky and other EU leaders announced their support for a 30-day ceasefire as a first step.
There is this ceasefire for 30 days proposal that is very clearly now on the table.
It's unconditional ceasefire for 30 days.
Putin, however, suggested that any ceasefire was a matter for negotiations. He said could take place in Istanbul later this week. Putin said Russia had proposed several ceasefires, including a moratorium on striking energy facilities, an Easter truce, and most recently a 72-hour truce during celebrations marking 80 years since Soviet victory in World War II. None of those were agreed between the two sides, and each accused the other of continuing to attack in force during the supposed truce periods.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, as usual, we have some very interesting stories. Now, the first one that I want to talk about, Mustafa, is this one. Turkey is ready for Ukraine truce talks. You just saw in the news report earlier that President Erdogan has invited the Ukrainian and Russian leaders to Istanbul to hold talks to find a solution to the war in Ukraine. Please tell us more.
But as you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin yesterday offered direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul in terms of putting an end to the ongoing conflicts in the Eastern Europe. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan yesterday held a phone conversation with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to discuss what can be done in terms of bringing long-lasting peace and stability to the Eastern Europe region. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday also announced that he will be waiting for Russian leader Putin in Istanbul on Thursday, these Thursdays. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as you know, is always offering to host peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. As you know, US President Donald Trump is also pushing for ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And this week, maybe we will see important meetings between the Russian and Ukrainian decision makers. Yes, Zelensky announced his determination to come to Turkey's Istanbul to meet with his Russian President Vladimir Putin. But right now we don't know that whether President Putin will come to Turkey or not. I think Putin will take Turkey's offers into the consideration, and he will come to Turkey to meet with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky, because international pressure is right now mounting on both Ukraine and Russia to halt their war in the Eastern Europe. As you know, at the weekend, important European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also paid an official visit to Ukraine to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and they are also calling upon Russia to accept ceasefire in terms of halting the war between two important neighbors in Eastern Europe. I think Turkey's peace diplomacy will yield positive results for Europe's long-standing peace and stability this week. I hope Putin and Zelensky will be able to meet in Turkey's financial and cultural capital, Istanbul, and it will yield a blueprint for long-lasting ceasefire agreement between two warring sides.
Mustafa, also there's the story about Palestinians, about the Gazans who are continuing to suffer from Israeli attacks, from the Israeli genocide. Now, almost 53,000 people have been killed in Palestine in the occupied Gaza Strip. And European leaders have not just called on Russian and Ukrainian leaders, they're also pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stop the attacks. Now, the Palestinian Refugee Agency says that they have not had food for over a month now, and the conditions in the occupied Gaza Strip are horrendous. So what is the UN saying now? What are the latest developments, Mustafa, over there?
Omar, as you know, since the October 7, 2023, Israeli security forces have been relentlessly continuing their military offensive in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip. And as a result of the Israeli military actions in the region, more than 50,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been murdered by the Israeli security forces, and Israel is currently preventing the entry of humanitarian aid to the region. And starvation problem, I think, is one of the most important problems in the occupied Palestinian territory. And all the regional and global stakeholders have been pressuring on Israel to allow the entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza. And yesterday, Hamas also announced its decision to release only living U.S.-Israeli hostage held by the Gaza Strip. And it is showing that right now the Palestinian resistance group Hamas is in favor of dialogue and diplomacy to halt Israel's military offensive. But on the other hand, Israeli decision makers are right now lobbying against any ceasefire in the region. And as you know, last week there were some reports about the relationships between U.S. President Donald Trump and Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This week, as you know, U.S. President Donald Trump is scheduled to pay an official visit to the Middle East. He will visit Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Maybe he will announce important decisions about the ongoing Israeli offensive in the region. Right now, we know that Trump is willing to exclude Israel and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from the geopolitical structure in the region. I hope Trump's diplomatic engagements with other Arab nations will bring a long-standing peace and stability to the Middle East region.
Indeed, Eden Alexander is the last American hostage who has survived the Israeli genocide on the occupied Gaza Strip. Now, let's hope that his release will enable Hamas, Israel, and the Trump administration to make a ceasefire, which could be possible and which could stay for a longer period. Now, also, Mustafa, I want to take a look at some other headlines. Inflation expectations. The Turkish government has again said that we are taking all the necessary measures in terms of economy, in terms of political measures. We are taking all those measures to ensure that inflation goes down. Now, also, there's another important story, Mustafa. The government has detailed a new 2030 industry strategy eyeing high-tech drive. Now, this is basically what Erdogan has stressed upon for the past few years, that the West, Turkey should not be dependent on the West. Turkey should have its own plans for its defense industry, for its technology industry. So these are some of the things. This new measure was posted in the official Gazette yesterday as well, where Turkey is focusing on improving its industry strategy and bringing more technology to the defense industry as well. Another thing that I want to touch upon, Mustafa, is the ongoing operation against the FETÖ terror group. Now, the Turkish government has taken new moves and has targeted FETÖ's operations in Balkan countries. Mustafa, the last one that I want to ask you about is the NATO summit of foreign ministers in Antalya. Tell us more about that.
Omar, NATO's foreign ministers will gather in Turkey's Mediterranean resort city Antalya this week, and it will coincide with the ongoing peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. As you know, Turkey is one of the most important contributors to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Turkey is playing a vital role in terms of keeping peace and stability in the European continent. But on the other hand, Donald Trump's administration's some steps in terms of Ukraine, Russia are sparking fears among European allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization over the U.S. commitment to European security. I think Turkey is right now facilitating talks between among allies in terms of ensuring long-lasting peace and stability in the old continent. I hope this meeting held by the NATO's foreign ministers will give a blueprint for the Leaders Summit, which will be held in next month. I hope this meeting will be able to give both allies, all allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because if the allies want to see peace and stability in the European continent, I think they will be supposed to increase their bilateral or multilateral defense cooperation.
Mustafa, thank you for updating us on the top headlines from the front page of Daily Sabah. Now let's take a look at this news report and we'll be right back.
The Turkish government's initiative to create a terror-free country marks a historic step toward lasting peace and stability. This bold and comprehensive initiative seeks to address decades of conflict, promote national unity, and foster a future of harmony for all citizens. At the heart of the initiative is a commitment to ending terrorism and violence that has plagued the nation for generations. By encouraging dialogue, disarmament, and peaceful resolutions, the initiative seeks to break the cycle of violence and open new pathways for reconciliation and cooperation. The government's approach focuses on engaging all segments of society, from political leaders to local communities, in a collective effort to heal the wounds of the past. This inclusive process underscores the importance of unity and understanding, ensuring that all voices are heard and that the desire for peace transcends political and ideological divides. Through a series of measures designed to build trust and promote goodwill, the initiative is creating an environment where dialogue can flourish. Efforts include fostering political and legal reforms, addressing the root causes of conflict, and ensuring that the benefits of peace are felt across every region of the country. This initiative not only aims to end violence but also seeks to lay the foundation for a new era of prosperity. The end of terrorism would allow the nation to focus its energy on economic development, infrastructure improvement, and the well-being of its citizens. A peaceful and stable environment is essential for attracting investment, promoting growth, and creating job opportunities for future generations. As the government continues its efforts, there is hope that the country will emerge stronger, more united, and better positioned to face the challenges of the future. The Terror-Free Initiative represents not just the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new chapter in Turkey's history, one that is characterized by peace, security, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow for all its people.
Welcome back to the program. Now joining us from the Pakistani capital is political analyst Javed Rana. Javed, welcome to the program. Javed, we've seen over the last few days the tensions between India and Pakistan. Let's start with that first. How are you looking at this ceasefire? And there were many countries that were involved as well, the United States, the UAE, Qatar, and even Türkiye. So please tell us about the latest developments.
I think the world, more particularly India and Israel, had underestimated Pakistan. They thought that Pakistan is just using it's a nuclear weapon as a blackmail, and it doesn't have the conventional parity with India. So what happened that in Pakistan has defeated militarily in the conventional battlefield, and we have seen now that India, I mean, it's around dozens of, I would say perhaps over 2 dozens of its military bases across India, they were hit hard, and their other military installations were hit hard, but it only happened when India had carried out missiles attack on Pakistan's mosques, on Pakistan's religious schools, calling them as a hub of terrorism. I think in Pakistan, instead of retaliating and killing their civilians or attacking on their temples, they targeted essentially on their military bases and military infrastructure from where India was attacking. That is something India was not expecting. They were thinking that after missiles attack, Pakistan would retaliate at the line of control. It's a de facto border between two parts of the disputed Kashmir region, and then it will end the matter. India had raised a white flag. But what Pakistan did, Pakistan had some kind of an offensive defense, which means that when India was carrying out attacks, it was also carrying out the kind of operation that from within its own territory, it was shooting down Indian fighter jets, which also included so-called premier rifle jets. So India realized that it needs to go for some kind of ceasefire. At the end of the day, when Pakistan said that now it is going to retaliate, and it was a massive retaliation with the Turkish drones, and then India approached Turkey, India approached Saudi Arabia, and more particularly, India used its clout on USA, and then USA came in between. They enforced this ceasefire. But we should not forget the Americans initially, they sounded that they are least interested in this conflict because the Americans behind the scene were encouraging, abetting Indians to carry out attacks. Israel was encouraging Indians to carry out these attacks, but when they saw that India is now being beaten up badly, and India was publicly saying that if Pakistan further does not attack on Pakistan, we are ready to we are ready to cease hostilities. I mean, they were publicly saying it, their spokespersons were publicly saying it, but Pakistan did not stop the retaliation. It only happened when it had a clear edge. And I think that has changed the dynamics, the political dynamics, the military dynamics in the country, and also in the region and across the Western capital. Now there is a reassessment of Pakistan. The country whose economy was so bad and everybody thought that Pakistan would not be able to sustain Indian military aggression. But now I think there is a reassessment. Americans are quite upset because India was its ally, and they thought that its ally would be able to contain China, but it failed even before a country which is 5 times smaller than its territory. And I think qualitatively, Pakistan has beaten up India, and that is a kind of a situation in Pakistan where everybody is jubilant.
Javed, over the past few hours, we've seen this statement from the PKK terror group that it will dissolve itself. Now, Pakistan and Turkey both have fought terrorism over the last few decades. How are you looking at this statement by the PKK terror group, and how will this benefit the region?
I think we have to see a broader picture. The broader picture is that there is an alliance between Israel and India. And then there is also an undeclared alliance between Turkey, Pakistan, and China. And the military technology, the high-end technology of Turkey in form of its drones, in form of many of its other weapons, because Turkey and Pakistan have a very great cooperation in the defense industry. And then similarly fashion, China and Pakistan have their cooperation, and China has been exporting its high-tech technology to Pakistan. I think it was a kind of a battle whereby China, Turkey, Pakistan on one side, and India, Israel, and the USA on the another side. I think that is a bigger picture. Now, in that context, now Turkey has beaten up PKK terrorists. They are also known as YPJ in Syria and with other nomenclature. And Turkey had that success because it has a new government in Syria. And Turkey had played a key role last year by bringing down Assad government. I think that was the key reason that now we have seen that Turkey has basically isolated these PKK terrorist groups all over the region. It's in Iraq, it's in Syria, and it's in Turkey itself. It is a group which is responsible for killing 40,000 people. I think this is a historical day for the Turkey. And it has raised the image and the status of the President Tayyip Erdogan as a statesman who is fighting against terrorists in the Middle East, but at the same time also supporting its ally Pakistan. And now I think after these two major developments, where I think it is a signal to the Israel that its technology has collapsed in Pakistan, because these were the Israeli drones which had Pakistan shot down. 84 drones were shot down. Even the common people of Pakistan, they were hitting with their guns at these drones, and they were playing with those drones. I think it is a collapse of the Israeli technology in Pakistan. That is one side. And in Syria, I think this is a great setback to Israel, because its supporter terror group YPG has now surrendered, because Turkey, in a very sustained manner in the northeast of Syria, it launched operations against these terrorist groups. In a similar fashion, it had a very sustained military operations against these terrorist groups in Iraq. Now, this group was so much actually weakened that now it came on the negotiating tables largely on the terms and conditions that Ankara had laid down. And that is a great success story. My understanding of the situation is that President Tayyip Erdogan's political insight is changing the political dynamics, not only in the Middle East, but also in the South Asia. You will see sooner or later, something has already happened in Bangladesh. I believe that it's a matter of months, maybe by the end of this year, there will be a government in Bangladesh which is going to be more aligned with the President Turkey. You may recall that President Tayyip Erdogan had recalled Turkey's ambassador from Bangladesh when Hasina Wajid was there, and she was hanging pro-Islamist groups, their leaders, simply because they had supported Pakistani military forces against the uprising. So I think overall these terrorist groups are winding down because of Turkey's help.
Political analyst Javed Rana, thank you for joining us on the program today. Anews editor Mustafa, a very warm welcome. Thank you to you as well for being on the program.
Thanks for hosting me, Omar.
And that wraps up this edition of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with more insights.